She dragged him through the snow with her bare hands, 80 pounds. 20 feet. No one coming. This man, the one who had closed the door in her face 12 days ago, was dying in his own yard. Wind off the bee horns. The fire inside burned down to almost nothing. She fell, got up. Did not let go. Inside, when the warmth began pulling him back, he called out a name in the dark. Not hers, somewhere out there beyond the tree line. Another man was already riding toward this light. He knew she was here. He had been waiting for exactly this. And spring was 3 months away. The wind came in off the Bighorn Mountains like it had a grudge. Not the kind of cold that settles slow and patient over a landscape. The kind that moves with intention. That finds the gaps in a coat, the inch of exposed neck above a collar, the thin place where a glove meets a cuff, and presses in hard and deliberate. Like it wants to be felt personally. Ellen Voss felt it personally. She had been walking for 3 hours since the road disappeared. Not gradually. Not in the way roads sometimes thin to a suggestion before giving out entirely. The road had simply stopped existing with the 6 inches of new snow, and she had kept moving anyway because stopping was not a choice she was willing to put on the table. Not yet. Not with the Harmon farm 2 days behind her and nothing in her coat pockets but a heel of cornbread wrapped in cloth that had gone stiff with cold, and a folded letter she no longer needed to read because she had memorized it against her will somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd mile. Dear Mrs. Voss, we regret that we are unable to continue your employment at this time. Regret, that was the word they used. Like regret was something that kept a person warm. Like regret bought a meal or put a roof over a head or told the Wyoming winter to hold off another week while a woman figured out her next move. She adjusted the bundle on her back and kept walking. The bundle was not heavy by any reasonable measure. 1 change of clothes. A bone-handled knife her mother had left her. A tin cup. A photograph she hadn't looked at in 8 months but couldn't bring herself to leave behind. Everything else, the furniture, the kitchen tools, the quilts she'd pieced herself over 3 winters of marriage had gone with the ranch. Gone with Thomas. Gone into the specific silence that follows a man who dies owing money to someone larger and colder than the weather. Harlan Pruitt's name did not come to her right away. It rarely did anymore. She had trained herself to approach it sideways, the way you approach a dog you're not sure of. You don't look directly. You let it know you're there. You wait and see if it growls. The name always growled. She had seen his signature on 7 different documents in the weeks after Thomas died. 7. She had sat at the kitchen table in the house that was still technically hers for 11 more days and read each one with the careful attention she used to give to seed catalogs and weather almanacs, reading the way a person reads when they're looking for the error, the loophole, the sentence that means something other than what it appears to mean. There was no error, there was no loophole. Harlan Pruitt had written his intentions into those documents with the precision of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again, and the law of Crook County, Wyoming, in the year of our Lord 1887, saw no reason to disagree with him. She had left the house on a Tuesday, taken the bundle, walked out the front door without looking back, because looking back was a thing she had decided against. That was 6 weeks ago. 4 farms since then, 4 back doors. 4 sets of eyes that moved from her face to her hands to the absence of a man standing behind her, and then arrived at the same conclusion by slightly different routes. The Harmon farm had lasted longest 11 days of real work. Good work, the kind she was built for, before Mrs. Harmon had pulled her aside in the root cellar and said, with genuine-sounding sorrow, that her husband felt it wasn't suitable. Suitable, another word that did not keep a person warm. She knew where she was going. That was the thing she kept returning to when her boots skidded on the ice beneath the snow, when her fingers went past cold into a deep structural ache that meant they had stopped registering temperature and started registering something more fundamental. She knew where she was going. She had a destination. That was more than she'd had on a Tuesday in November when she walked out of a house that no longer belonged to her with a bundle that weighed less than her grief. Grant Sumner's ranch. She had been there 12 days ago. The memory of it was precise in the way that humiliating memories always are, every detail preserved in the particular amber of a moment you'd rather not revisit but cannot stop revisiting. 4 miles to the gate in weather that had not yet decided to be a storm. The walk itself had been almost tolerable. She had rehearsed what she would say, not a speech, nothing pleading, just the plain inventory of her qualifications stated without apology. She had managed livestock. She had kept accounts. She had done every kind of ranch work that needed doing, except the kind that required a second pair of hands, and she had sometimes managed that too. She knocked at the back door the way a woman looking for work was supposed to knock, not timid, not demanding, something in between that announced a person of substance who understood the appropriate entrance. The door opened. Grant Sumner was taller than she'd expected, which she hadn't expected to notice, but noticed anyway. The kind of tall that comes with a certain settled quality, like the height has been there long enough that the man has stopped thinking about it. His face was weathered in the specific way of men who work outside in Wyoming, not roughened but rather reduced, the way weather reduces things to their essential structure, strips away whatever is soft or ornamental, and leaves out what was always underneath. He had grey eyes with the quality of someone who observed carefully and commented rarely, and he looked at her once, a single, unhurried look that took her in from her worn boots to her hat, and said, without meanness, without anything that could be precisely called cruelty, "I don't have use for a woman who can't do a man's work." She had wanted to say something, several things in fact. The list was long and some items on it were, in retrospect, probably unwise. But she had learned by then 4 farms, 6 weeks, the accumulated education of being told no slightly different accents that arguing from a back doorstep was a waste of both breath and dignity. She had looked at him for 1 beat longer than was comfortable for either of them. Then she had turned and walked back the 4 miles to the road. She had not cried. She made a note of that afterward, not with pride exactly, but with something like acknowledgement. She had noted that she had not cried, and then she had tried the Glenmore place and been told no in fewer words, and after that she had tried 2 more. And after that the Harmon farm had offered 11 days before deciding she wasn't suitable, and now she was back on the road to Grant Sumner's ranch because there was nowhere else between her and the next town, and the next town was 20 miles northeast, and the storm had eaten the northeast. So, Grant Sumner. She did not let herself think too specifically about what she would say when she got there. She was going to ask to sleep in the barn. She was not going to ask for more than that. She had become very precise about the things she asked it for, because precision protected something she was not willing to give up, the clean knowledge that she had not begged. She had asked. There was a difference. She understood the difference at a molecular level, the way she understood the difference between ice that would hold weight and ice that would not. The yard light at the ranch came into view through the snow as a smear of gold, formless. At first, the way all lights look through heavy weather, like they exist only as concepts rather than sources. She fixed her eyes on it, 1 foot and then the other. The bundle on her back shifted when she hit a rut hidden under the snow, and she caught herself, steadied, kept moving. She almost walked directly over him. The shape in the snow did not register as a person immediately. That was the honest accounting of the moment, the kind of truth that does not reflect well but is nonetheless true. Her mind catalogued it first as a fence rail come loose in the wind, then as a calf down in the drifts, then as the lantern light from the window caught the fabric of a coat and the curve of a shoulder as what it actually was. A man, face down, 1 arm stretched forward as though he had been trying to reach the cabin door and had simply exhausted the means to continue. The thought that arrived first was not that he might be dead. It was that he was very still. There is a difference in the quality of stillness between a person who is unconscious and a person who is gone, and Ellen Voss had sat with both kinds in her life. And she registered the difference before she registered anything else. She dropped the bundle and ran the last 20 feet. She turned him over, and the cold had already done what cold does with patience and thoroughness. His face had gone the color of the snow under him, the lips edging toward blue at the corners. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his throat, and found the pulse there not gone, but diminished, slow and arrhythmic, the way a clock sounds when the mainspring is almost spent. The kind of pulse that does not announce intentions. The lantern from the window threw just enough light to confirm what she had already understood. This was Grant Sumner, the man who had told her 12 days ago that he had no use for her. He was not going to die in his own yard. She did not pause on the coincidence of it. There would be time for that later, or there would not be. And either way, it had nothing to do with what is needed to happen in the next 90 seconds. You are not going to die in your own yard. She said it the way you say something to a horse that is about to step wrong, not a question, not a request, a statement of what is going to be true because the alternative is not acceptable. His eyes did not open. Grant Sumner, sharper now, the name like a hand on a shoulder. Still nothing. She took stock of the situation the way her father had taught her to take stock of a situation. Not the whole of it, which was overwhelming, but the next immediate thing, which was manageable. The next immediate thing was getting him inside. She could not carry him. He outweighed her by a significant margin. She put it at 80 pounds, possibly more, and she had been running on bread and cold creek water for 3 days. And her arms had the specific weakness of a person who has been spending energy she doesn't have. But she had worked farms since she was 11 years old, and she had moved calves and equipment and fence posts and the dead weight of things that could not cooperate, and she understood the mechanics of moving mass that has no interest in being moved. She got behind him, hooked her hands under his arms, locked her fingers across his chest and heaved. The first foot was the worst, then the second. The snow fought her at every inch, and her boots found no purchase on the frozen ground beneath it, and she went down once on one knee with a crack that sent white fire up her leg, and she hauled herself back without releasing her grip. The wind came in from the north and threw ice against the back of her neck. Her breath came in short, hard gasps that burned all the way down her throat. 20 feet. It was 20 feet to the cabin door. She counted them. She had learned to count things in hard moments. It was a trick her mother had used, not prayer, not encouragement, just mathematics. Countable things. How many jars in the cellar, how many cords of wood, how many steps to the end of the row. Numbers did not lie, did not comfort falsely, did not require more than you had. They just told you how far. 14 feet, 9 feet. Before she got the cabin door open with her elbow, it was not latched, which meant he had gone out in a hurry, which meant something had required his immediate attention in the middle of what was already a bad storm, which meant he had not been careless, just unlucky, which was a distinction that felt important to her, though she could not have said exactly why. She dragged him over the threshold, his coat catching on the raised wood, and kicked the door shut behind them with enough force to rattle the latch. The cabin was cold. The fire had burned down to a thin red line along the bottom of the hearth, coals that were still alive but only technically, doing the minimum required to call themselves fire rather than ash. But cold was relative. After the yard, this was shelter, and shelter was the thing between a person and the absence of everything else. Ellen allowed herself 4 seconds to breathe. Then she turned her attention to the fire. There was a wood box beside the hearth, half full, which was exactly the kind of detail you noticed with the specific gratitude usually reserved for things you had prayed for. She built the fire up the way you build a fire when you need it to work and not merely to exist. Kindling laid right, the bigger splits on top, the air allowed in from the bottom. She blew on the coals until they brightened, and the kindling caught, and the flame climbed the split oak with the sound of paper tearing slowly. Then she turned back to Grant Sumner and assessed him properly for the first time. His coat was soaked through. So was the wool shirt beneath it. She removed both with the efficient impersonality of someone who has stripped wet clothes off a sick person before and understands that modesty is a luxury that applies in other circumstances. There was a gash at his right temple, not deep but recent, blood dried to a dark crust in his hair from whatever had knocked him down before the cold finished the work. The wound was consistent with a fall against a fence post or frozen ground, not with anything deliberate. She noted this and moved on. She found a wool blanket folded on the chest at the foot of his bed and wrapped it around him tight, then positioned him as close to the growing heat as the room allowed. On a shelf near the window, she saw 2 tin cups sitting side by side, the ordinary detail of a household arranged for 2 people, left unchanged by a man who had not yet found a reason to rearrange it. She took 1 cup down, filled it from the water she was already heating, and set to work. She pressed a warm cloth to his hands first, then his wrists, then the back of his neck, the places where blood runs close to the surface and warmth can find its way back in fastest. She had learned this during a hard winter 3 years, before Thomas died, when a hired hand had come in from the north field half frozen, and she had improvised with what she had, and it had worked. and she had filed the knowledge away with the specific attentiveness she gave to anything useful. She worked without pausing, because pausing meant her mind caught up to her body, and her body was running on nothing, and catching up was not something she could afford before this man was stable. His color began to shift somewhere around the second hour. The blue left his lips first, then the white in his cheeks softened to something that was not quite a living color but was moving in the right direction. His breathing deepened. She sat back on her heels and watched the rise and fall of his chest and felt something in her own chest clench, a thing she hadn't realized was clenched until it let go. Then the fever came. She had expected it. The body, after extreme cold, sometimes overcorrects with a violence that frightens people who don't understand what it means. This was not the body failing. This was the body fighting, which was a different thing entirely, though it could look the same from the outside. His temperature climbed fast, the way temperatures do when the system has been suppressed and then released, and he grew restless beneath the blanket, turning his head, the muscles in his arms tightening and releasing with the irregular rhythm of dreams that are not peaceful. She worked through the night. Cold cloth fuss on his head changed every quarter hour as they warmed. Water kept at the right temperature. The fire maintained at the precise level between too little and too much. She moved between these tangsinas with the unhurried efficiency of someone who understands that what mattered was consistency, soft presence, the unbroken attention of someone who was not going to leave. She talked to him sometimes. Not words that meant anything specific, just the low, continuous sound of a voice in the dark, which she had found with Thomas in one of his bad nights near the end, kept a person's nervous system from the specific terror of waking in darkness and not knowing where they were or whether they were alone. At what she estimated was the deepest part of the night, no way to know the hour, the clock on the mantel having stopped and the snow outside making the darkness uniform, he called out. Not words. Something that came from below the level of language, from the place in a person that fear lives before it finds its name. And without deliberating about it, she reached across and took his hand in both of hers still. Here. The words arrived without premeditation. You are still here. His fingers tightened around hers with the grip of someone fighting toward the surface of something deep and cold. She did not let go. The fever broke in the grey hour before dawn. She felt it happen. Felt the rigid quality go out of his body all at once, the way tension leaves when the thing being held against finally releases. He breathed out long and slow, and his forehead under her hand went from dry, dangerous heat to the damp, cooling normalcy of a temperature returning to itself. She pressed the back of her hand to his face and felt the change, and sat back in the chair beside the hearth and let her hands shake. They had been wanting to shake for hours. She had not permitted it. Now she permitted it. She looked at her hands trembling in the firelight and noted them the way she noted most things factually, without drama. They were shaking because she had been holding herself together by force for the better part of 8 hours, and the crisis was past, and the body does what it needs to do when the emergency is over. She was not in danger. He was not in danger. The shaking was information, not alarm. She let it pass. It passed. Before she closed her eyes in the chair, not deciding to sleep, merely failing to stay awake, she noticed what was on the table beside the hearth. A folded document, official-looking, the kind of paper that comes from a lawyer's office or a land agent, heavy stock with precise typeface. She had not read it, had no right to read it, and did not read it now. But the name at the top was visible without reading. She had not been looking for it, and there it was, Harlan Pruitt. Regarding the matter of Sumner Ranch acreage. North Pasture deed of sale. She looked at it for a long moment. The document was unsigned. The line at the bottom where a man's name was supposed to go was blank, which meant Pruitt had not yet gotten what he wanted, which meant the pressure that produced this document was ongoing rather than concluded. She closed her eyes. Outside, the storm that had very nearly killed. Grant Sumner continued its work on the landscape, patient and indifferent, covering everything equally. When she woke, pale winter light was coming under the door and through the cracks in the shuttered windows, and Grant Sumner was sitting up, not lying where she had left him. Sitting up. On his own with the blanket across his shoulders, a tin cup in both hands, and the specific expression of a man who has spent some portion of the morning reassessing the whole of his situation. The fire had been built up. She had not heard him do it. which meant she had been asleep more thoroughly than she'd realized. And there was the smell of coffee which he had apparently made from what he found in the larder. He was looking at her, not with the vague, lost look of someone just come out of a bad night, with the clear, direct regard of someone who has had time to observe and to think, and who is looking at the thing he has been thinking about. Ellen straightened in the chair. Her neck objected. She ignored it. You shouldn't be upright, matter of fact. Not a concern she was going to wrap in softness, because he did not look like a man who wanted softness, and she did not have any to spare. His voice came out roughened from the night, but its quality was clear enough a voice, accustomed to being the last word on things. My ranch, your body. She met his eyes without any particular effort. The fever broke an hour ago. You're not as recovered as you feel. A silence settled between them that was not uncomfortable, so much as mutual the silence of two people taking stock of a situation that neither had planned for, and both needed to understand. He looked at her over the rim of the tin cup. You came back. I came to ask to sleep in the barn, exact as she'd make it. As I wasn't going to ask for more than that. Something moved through his expression, not surprise, something more considered. The barn, it was warm enough, and drier than the road. He was quiet. Looked down at the cup. I found you in the yard. You were in the yard. I found you. The distinction landed. He accepted it without argument, which told her something about the quality of his thinking even when diminished. You dragged me in. I dragged you in by yourself. There was no one else available. His eyes came back to her. She noticed, this time, that they were not the dark color she had taken them for, on the back doorstep, 12 days ago. A deep gray, the color of the sky, about an hour before it commits to weather. And there was something in them now that had not been there the first time she had stood before him, asking for work, not gratitude, which was too simple, but a quality of actual attention. The kind that occurs when a person has been forced to revise an assumption and is still in the process of doing so. You saved my life. Statement, not question. She thought about this with the same honest precision she gave to most things. You had been dead before dawn without intervention. I intervened. What you call that is your business. I call it saving my life. She didn't argue. Grant Sumner set the tin cup down on the hearth and looked at his own hands, for a moment steadier than hers had been an hour ago, but showing the fine tremor of a body that had been somewhere difficult and was still finding its way back. Then he looked up. I need to make a proposal. You've made proposals to me before. She kept her voice level. The last one involved telling me I was inadequate for your requirements. He held her gaze. Did not look away, which she noted. I was wrong about that. 3 words. She had not expected 3 words. She had expected to work harder for an acknowledgement, to earn it by argument, to have to present evidence that she had literally kept him alive through a blizzard as Exhibit A. 3 words. Delivered without ceremony, landed differently than anything she'd been braced for. She did not say thank you. She did not say yes, you were. She waited. She did because there was more and she could feel the weight of it. I need a housekeeper. He said this carefully, as though he understood the word might not be sufficient. A cook? Someone who knows how to manage a place properly. I have not managed it properly since my wife died. A pause that cost him something. 4 years is a long time to let things go without saying so out loud. Ellen studied the fifer for a moment, then studied him. What you're describing is closer to a ranch manager who also cooks. That may be accurate. And what would the arrangement be? Wages, your own room. You stay through spring, and if it suits both of us, we discuss this beyond spring. She looked at the document on the table. She did not point at it. She did not need to. Grant followed her gaze, and when he looked back at her, something in his expression confirmed what she had already understood from the name at the top of the page. Harlan Pruitt has been attempting to purchase the north section of this property. Flat, factual, as though reading from a ledger. He has made the offer 3 times. The offer increases each time, which means he needs the land more than the price suggests. I have declined 3 times, and the 4th time? There will not be a 4th time. She looked at him steadily. When you told me 12 days ago that you had no use for a woman who couldn't do a man's work, was it what you actually believed, or was it what you say to everyone? Grant was quiet for a measured stretch of time, long enough that she knew the answer wasn't being avoided, just being assembled, honestly. I say it to everyone. Then, after another beat, but with everyone else, I mean it differently. How did you mean it with me? He stopped, looked at his hands again, back at her. I looked at your hands when you were standing at my door. I saw what was in them. I closed the door anyway. That's the honest accounting of it. She had not expected him to be this direct. She filed it away under things to reassess about Grant Sumner, a category that was growing faster than she'd anticipated. All right, she said. He waited. All right, she said again. I'll stay. Something settled in his face, not relief, exactly. More like the particular ease of a man who has been holding a decision in tension and has finally been allowed to put it down. I'll move my things from the back room by tomorrow, said it, with the finality of a person who has moved to logistics. No hurry. She stood up from the chair, which required more effort than she was going to show. Tomorrow is sufficient. He looked at her with something that was almost the beginning of something lighter. You always manage people this directly? I manage things the way they need to be managed. She was already moving toward the hearth to check the fire. People, animals, kitchen supplies. The method is the same. You look at what's there, decide what's needed, do it without drama. Without drama, he repeated. Without drama, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the flatness of a man stating something he would rather not have to state. Pruitt will be here by noon. He said it the way he might note that the water trough needed checking. Practical. But he catalogued as I am telling you this because you have earned the right to know. He'll have heard there was someone at the ranch overnight. In a town this size, information moves on the same current as weather. Ellen set another split of oak on the fire. Watched the flame take it, let him come. Outside, the wind eased by another degree. The storm was pausing, or at least pausing, pulling back to reconsider. The cabin held the warmth she had built in it all night, steady and sufficient. Harlan Pruitt did not knock. This was a deliberate choice, a performance of familiarity. The door opened with the ease of a man who had decided in advance that the gesture of knocking would concede something he was not prepared to concede, and he came through it with the self-possessed quality of someone who has calculated that the room belongs to him in all the ways that matter. Even if the deed has not yet transferred, he was not large. This was the first thing she noted about him, because large men who want to intimidate you announce it with their body, which gives you information. Harlan Pruitt was of moderate height, moderately built, with the compact, settled look of a man who had learned to project size without having it. His coat was good. His boots were excellent. His face had the preserved quality of someone who had never done work that weather could reach, and his eyes were a particular pale blue, the color of a person who had practiced being estimated so long that the expression had become genuine. He looked at Grant first, who had managed to get a citizen on the edge of the bed, blanket still across his shoulders, his grip on the bedpost less about support than about having something solid to hold. Then Pruitt looked at Ellen, standing at the hearth with a wooden spoon in her hand and flour on her apron. Grant, warm, concerned, the voice of a man at a church social, not a man walking uninvited through someone else's front door. I heard you were taken ill. I came as soon as the road was passable. Grant's voice was not warm and not cold, neutral in the way of a man who has decided to keep his intentions off his face until he knows what's necessary. Harlan, Pruitt's pale eyes moved to Ellen, moved over her the way they might move over a piece of land whose acreage he was quietly calculating, then came back to Grant. I don't believe I've met your guest. Ellen did not offer her name. She turned back to the fire and gave the pot her attention, because there was something in being assessed like property that she had learned to respond to by becoming extremely interested in whatever she was doing. It communicated, without argument, that the assessment had not registered in the way intended. This is Ellen Voss, Grant said. She'll be managing the ranch going forward. The specific quality of Pruitt's silence in the next 2 seconds was the most informative thing he had done since entering the room. It lasted exactly as long as it took him to process the name and locate it in whatever filing system he kept for people and their relationships to each other. Not long. He was quick, Voss, as though tasting it. Thomas Voss's widow, Thomas Voss's wife. She did not turn from the fire. Widow is what you become after the fact. Wife is what I was. A silence of a different texture followed. She could feel the recalibration happening across the room and found it privately useful information. Pruitt moved further into the cabin with the smooth, purposeful motion of a man who does not allow other people's spatial comfort to constrain him. He settled near the table. Near, she noted, the document with his name at the top. He either didn't notice she could see it or didn't care. Probably didn't care. Men like Pruitt rarely bothered to hide things they had already decided were inevitable. "Grant, I'm glad to find you on the mend." The warmth held steady. "I was concerned after what happened to the north fence line last night. Some damage in the storm, I'm told. I hadn't heard about the fence line." Grant's voice had not changed. 3 sections from what my man could see this morning from the road. A shame. This time of year, that kind of repair is expensive. A pause with the weight of a hand laid on a shoulder. "My offer on the north pasture would save you that difficulty. And given the condition you're in, it seems like a burden you don't need." The spoon in Ellen's hand moved through the contents of the pot in steady, even circles. She noted the sequence of what had just been said. The fence line damage, presented as neutral information. The offer, presented as relief rather than acquisition. The mention of Grant's condition, presented as care rather than leverage. Each sentence doing 2 jobs. The voice of a man who had learned that the most effective pressure is the one that presents itself as a fever. Grant said, "The north pasture isn't for sale." Pruitt's smile did not change. Of course. I only mention it because the answer is the same as the last 3 times you asked. Still neutral. Still without heat. "It isn't for sale, Harlan." A pause in which something recalculated behind the pale eyes. Then Pruitt's gaze moved deliberately back to Ellen. Not hostile. The smile that was not quite a smile, Mrs. Voss. "It's good to know you've found a situation. After the difficulties following your husband's passing? The difficulties you engineered," she turned from the fire then. Not with anger, because anger was a coin she spent carefully. Just turned. Faced him. "I appreciate clarity, Mr. Pruitt. It saves time." The smile held. It was an impressive smile. Technically, it did not waver, and it did not reach his eyes, which made it a remarkable demonstration of muscular control. "I'm not sure what you mean by that, Mrs. Voss. I mean that I have read the documents pertaining to my husband's estate rather carefully, and I have some views about the circumstances under which he came to sign them. But this morning isn't the occasion for that conversation." She kept her voice as level as the pot she was tending. "This morning I'm making breakfast." Pruitt looked at Grant, who was looking at Ellen with an expression she did not take the time to read because she was maintaining her attention on Pruitt. Then Pruitt retrieved his hat and held it with the particular care of a man who knows props and how to use them. "I'm glad to see you're in capable hands, Grant." Eyes moving once more to Ellen, not with hostility, but with the specific, cold quality of a man who has added an item to a list. "Mrs. Voss. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other." "I'm sure," she agreed. He left. The door closed with a sound that was not a slam and not quite nothing, a careful sound. The sound of a door being closed by a person demonstrating that they could close it gently, which is its own kind of statement. Grant said, "He sent someone to cut that fence line. Last night." "In the storm, I know." She turned back to the fire. "The biscuits were nearly done. He wanted you to need him. He wanted you thinking about repair costs and winter feed and everything that goes wrong when the north pasture is exposed, so that when he walked through that door this morning, it would feel like a solution instead of an acquisition." She could feel from Grant watching her. You understand how he operates?" "I understand because he operated the same way on my husband's estate." She pulled the biscuits from the heat. "Thomas was sick for 4 months before he died. Pruitt's documents arrived in the 2nd month, when Thomas was still lucid enough to sign, but not lucid enough to understand what he was signing. I wasn't in the room. I was told afterward that I hadn't been needed for that particular meeting." Grant was quiet. She brought the food to the table, sat across from him with the straightforward manner of 2 people who have agreed on a thing and are now proceeding. She watched him eat with the assessment of someone monitoring recovery. Appetite was a sign. Color was a sign. The steadiness of his hands was a sign. All the signs were moving in the right direction. "You're going to need help with that fence line today." She said it practically. "You're not well enough to do it yourself, and I don't know enough about your land yet to know how to find the break without wasting time. I have a hand who comes 3 days a week. Is today one of the 3? No. Then it will be you and me when you're rested enough." She did not ask if he was willing. She simply laid it out as the next immediate thing and let him respond to it as he chose. Grant picked up his fork. looked at her across the table with the eyes that had revised themselves this morning into something other than what she'd catalogued at a back doorstep. You always work like this? Like what? Like you already know what's next? She considered this honestly. I know what's next, mate, because I look at what's there and think it through. Most people don't stop long enough to think it through. They react or they freeze. I was taught that neither of those is as useful as just looking at the situation and deciding what it requires. He ate. The fire held. Outside, the snow had settled into the soft, committed fall of a storm that has made its decision and is not hurrying anymore. My wife would have. He stopped, picked up again. She was practical like that. Then quietly the name set down carefully like something with weight. Nora. Ellen did not fill the space around the name with anything. She let it be in the room what it was, not a wound to be treated, not a subject to be changed, just a name that belonged there. She sounds like she was capable, Ellen said finally. She was. He said it without sentimentality and without the particular flatness that conceals grief poorly. The way a person states something that is simply true and has been true long enough to live with comfortably, most of the time. She died in December of '83. I was away. I didn't make it back in time, Ellen. Looked at him. Held what he had said in the accurate place in her understanding of him, next to the document on the table and the fence line cut in the storm, and the voice she'd heard in the worst of the night calling that name like a person calling towards something that had already moved past hearing. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it in the way that those words sometimes mean what they're supposed to mean when they're not being used as a formality. Grant Sumner looked at his plate, then out the window, then back at the room, which was warm and smelled of coffee and biscuits and the clean wood smell of a fire doing its job. Yeah, he said. I know you are, he said it, not as though he was certain she meant it, but as though he was beginning to consider that she might. The morning passed between them in the manner of two people who have established the terms of a thing and are now living inside those terms for the first time, testing them for fit. Ellen washed the dishes. Grant moved to the chair by the hearth with the deliberate care of a man whose body had reminded him this morning that it had opinions about what he was allowed to do. He did not try to go outside. She noted that as evidence that whatever stubbornness had sent him out into its blizzard the night before had been temporarily overruled by common sense. She spent the afternoon learning the geography of the ranch house, not the emotional geography, which would come later, and which she was not rushing, but the practical kind, where the tools were kept and whether they were kept in a logical order, where the stores were and how they were inventoried, which they were not properly, where the weak points in the structure were, because every structure in Wyoming had weak points by February, and the question was whether they'd had to. She found a loose board just beneath the kitchen window that let cold air in along the bottom. She found that the pantry door had been rehung at some point and now did not sit flush, which meant it didn't seal, which meant the temperature variation in there was higher than it should be for the root vegetables that needed consistent cold. She found that the wood box was positioned on the wrong side of the hearth for a fish use functional, but requiring unnecessary steps in the dark. She did not fix any of these things that afternoon. She noted them. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. Fixing things in someone else's house, without being asked, was a declaration of permanence, and she had agreed to stay through spring, which was not the same as permanence. She would fix them when the time made it clear that fixing was appropriate. Grant watched her move through space with the attention of someone who is used to being alone in a place and is recalibrating to the presence of another person in it. He did not hover. He did not direct. He watched and said nothing, which she understood as the particular consideration of a man who knows the difference between observing and interfering. By evening, the fire had settled into its steady rhythm and the wind outside had dropped to a murmur. Ellen made soup from what she found in the larder: salt pork, dried corn, and a small onion that had kept through the cold, and set it on the table without ceremony. Grant ate without the wariness of a man uncertain what was expected of him in exchange for being fed. That wariness which she had anticipated was not there, which told her something about the particular quality of his self-possession. He was not a man who felt he needed to perform gratitude in order to justify receiving care. He simply received it the way a practical person receives useful things. After supper, when the dishes were cleared and the lamp was low and the evening had arrived at the particular stillness of a winter night that has decided not to be violent, Grant said, "Pruitt will come back, I know. Not just about the land." He was looking at the fire. "He'll want to know what you know. About Thomas's estate, about the documents. He'll want to know whether you're a threat to the arrangement he has in this county." Ellen looked at the Pruitt document still on the table. She had not touched it all day. "And am I?" Grant turned his head and looked at her directly. "I think you might be the first one." She held his gaze for a moment, and in that moment something was established between them that was not yet a partnership and not yet trust, but was the ground on which both of those things could eventually be built. If the winter held, if the land held, if two people who had each arrived at this evening carrying significant damage could manage to face the same direction long enough for something to take root. "Then he'll find that out," she said. Grant nodded once. Then he looked back at the fire, and the evening continued on its terms, and the storm that had passed left the ranch in the particular silence of a place that has been tested and is still standing. Ellen sat in the chair on her side of the hearth and thought about spring. Not with hope. Exactly, hope was a thing she had learned to hold carefully, having had it taken before. But with the attention of a woman who has looked at what is there and decided that what is there is worth the working. That was enough. For tonight it was enough. Outside, the snow lay still and white and unbroken over Sumner Ranch, over the fence line that would need repairing and the north pasture that would not be sold, and the road that had brought her here against all reasonable judgment. The lamp burned low. The fire held its ground. She did not look back. February came in without apology. Not the soft February of almanac illustrations, the kind with thawing creek beds and the first tentative suggestions of green at the fence lines. The February that arrived at Sumner Ranch arrived with the conviction of a season that had not finished what it started, and was not interested in sentiment about it. The cold pressed down from the bighorns with a consistency that felt less like weather and more like policy. The snow did not melt between storms. It accumulated in layers, each one preserving the one beneath it, so that by the second week of the month the drifts against the north wall of the barn held the compressed record of every storm since November, like the geological strata of a winter that intended to be remembered. 11 days had passed since the night Ellen dragged Grant Sumner across his own threshold. 11 days was not long, but 11 days of working the same land, eating at the same table, and moving through the same rooms in the particular proximity that a ranch house imposes on its occupants in winter. That was enough time to establish whether two people were going to be able to share a space without the space becoming a problem. The space was not a problem. What they had built was not friendship, not yet, and it was not the careful performance of compatibility that people sometimes mistake for the real thing. It was something more functional and in its way more durable, a working grammar. The underlying structure that makes possible before the language itself arrives. The thing that told her his silence over coffee was thinking and not displeasure. The thing that told him her efficiency moving through his kitchen was not a judgment on how he had kept it, but simply the way she worked. The thing that told them both gradually and without announcement that the other person's competence was not a threat to be managed, but a resource to be used. Grammar had been built the way all useful things are built, through the accumulation of small, reliable acts, each one tested against the previous ones to confirm the pattern was real. She fixed the loose board beneath the kitchen window on the 4th day. Once she had assessed that fixing it was appropriate and not presumptuous. She fixed the pantry door on the 6th. She repositioned the wood box on the 7th. After verifying through observation that Grant used the hearth the same way she did and would benefit from the change, he did not comment on any of these adjustments. He simply incorporated them the way a person incorporates a useful change when the change is correct and the source of it is not in question. On the 8th day, he left the supply order ledger open on the table with a note beside it that said, "Only. Your additions?" She sat down with the ledger and the stub of a pencil and added 7 items, removed 2 that were redundant, and changed the quantity on 4 others based on what the winter stores actually showed versus what had been ordered on assumption. She put the ledger back without comment. He came in, read it, and the following morning moved the hay supply from the old storage corner so she could use the space for the root vegetables that needed dry, cold air rather than the damp cold they were currently getting. On the 11th day, she stopped counting days. The mornings ran to a pattern now. Ellen up before first light, fire rebuilt, coffee on, first round of kitchen work underway before Grant came in from the barn. By the time he sat down to eat, she had usually identified 2 things that needed doing that he had not thought of yet, and 1 thing that could wait until spring if handled correctly now. She did not present these observations as instructions. She laid them out as information, if he offered in the tone of a second pair of eyes noting what was there, and he received them the way a capable person receives useful information without ceremony and without the false deference that would have made them both uncomfortable. What she had not prepared for was how much she was learning about the ranch itself. Not the surface of it, which she had assessed quickly in the first week, but the deeper structure, the way the land lay, which pastures drained well and which held water, where the fence lines were old and where they had been replaced, which of the cattle were Grant's breeding choices and which were inherited decisions he had not yet revised. This information came to her in pieces, through observation and through the specific kind of conversation that happens between 2 people doing work in proximity, practical, exact, without digression, the kind of talk that carries more information per sentence than most social conversation manages in a paragraph. Grant was not a talkative man. She had understood this from the first morning, but he was a precise one, and precision in a man who is not talkative produces a particular quality of speech, every sentence doing full work, nothing included that is not necessary, nothing omitted that is. She found that she could calibrate her own speech to match this, and that the calibration was not an effort, but a relief. The way finding the right tool for a task is a relief after using the wrong one. One morning over the ledger, reviewing what the cattle would need through the remaining weeks of winter, Grant said, "The North Pass pasture fence, 5 sections of original post and wire from the homestead claim. I've been meaning to address that since October. October has passed," she said, not unkindly. "March will come." He looked at her, then back at the ledger. Then he added north fence full assessment to the list of February tasks, below water trough heating and above barn roof east section. That was the quality of the exchange between them. Efficient. Honest, neither of them performing anything for the other's benefit. The relief of it, the specific relief of being in a room with someone who required nothing performative, was something Ellen chose not to examine too closely, because examining it would mean acknowledging how rare it was, and acknowledging that would lead somewhere she was not ready to go yet. She filed it under useful and moved on. It was in a drawer, and it was not where she had left it. This was the first thing she needed to establish, because the location of the object and the fact that it had moved told her something important about the man she was living alongside. On the evening of the 3rd day, when Ellen was reorganizing the shelf out above the hearth to make the lamp oil accessible, without moving 3 other things first, she tugged between the lamp base and the wall a small tin photograph, the size of a playing card, worn at the corners from handling. She recognized it immediately. She had set it on the table that first night, after it slipped from Grant's coat pocket when she stripped the wet layers off him in the dark and the cold. She had placed it face up on the table without looking at it properly. The way you handle something that belongs to someone else, present it. Don't examine it. In the morning, when she had woken to find him already upright and the fire already rebuilt, the photograph had been back in its place beside the lamp. He had gotten up before her. He had retrieved it from the table and returned it to the shelf. He had done this while she was still asleep in the chair, which meant it had been one of the first things he did after regaining the ability to do things. She had not remarked on it then, because there were more pressing matters and because it was not her business to remark on. But she had filed it. Filed the fact that this was the object he had reached for first, the object whose proper place he had restored before he restored anything else about the order of his house. She did not look at it now either. She moved it the inch required to complete the reorganization, set it back exactly where it had been, and continued working. But in the brief transit of the object between her hands, she had registered enough. A young woman, sitting on a fence rail, the particular ease in her posture of someone entirely comfortable in the body and place, and the photograph suggesting sang summer, Everything that Wyoming winter was not. She asked nothing about it. She did not need to. The information it provided was already complete in 2 parts. Grant Sumner kept this photograph where he could see it from his chair, and he had made sure it was there before he did anything else on the morning after the worst night of his recent life. Not hidden, not displayed for visitors. In the specific location that a person keeps something they want available to their own eyes, without making it a statement about themselves to anyone else. And the fact that returning it to that location had been his first coherent act told her more about his grief than any description would have. The grief was private and current and had its own address in this house, and she was not going to disturb it. What she did instead was notice the other things that carried the same information. The pair of boots near the back door, too small for Grant's feet, that had been there long enough to accumulate a fine layer of dust on the toe but had not been moved. The particular quilt on the chest, at the foot of the bed not utilitarian, pieced in a pattern that required planning and time, the kind of object a person makes for someone they intend to keep warm for a long time. The coffee tin on the shelf quant that was more than 3/4 full despite Grant clearly drinking coffee every morning, which meant he had bought a larger quantity than one person uses. The habit of provision for 2 outlasting the requirement for it. These were not sad details exactly. They were the details of a house that had been organized around a shared life and had not yet been reorganized around a solitary one, and there was in that a specific kind of faithfulness that she recognized without needing to name it. Thomas had been gone 14 months, and she still sometimes reached for his coat hook at the end of the day, before remembering there was no coat there. She understood the persistence of the body's habits after the heart's losses. She did not consider it weakness. She considered it evidence of how seriously a person had taken the thing they'd lost. On the evening of the 15th day, after supper, Grant did not go directly to his chair. He stood at the window for a long time looking out at the dark yard, and she recognized the posture without having seen it before, the posture of a person who is carrying something that has become too heavy for the hour. She had been about to go to her room. She stopped, sat down in the chair across from where he would sit when he was ready, and waited without making the waiting into a performance of waiting. He came into the chair eventually, sat, looked at the fire. She did not speak first. That was an important judgment. One of the things she had learned about the quality of his silence was that some silences in him were conclusions and some were preparations. And interrupting a preparation produced nothing useful, while waiting for it to complete itself produced honesty. This one was a preparation. She was sick 4 days before she died. His voice had the quality of someone who has rehearsed saying something so many times in their head that the words have worn smooth from handling. I didn't know. I was in Johnson County with the cattle. 3 days as out, which was where I was supposed to be, doing what I was supposed to be doing. He looked at the fire. The man I sent to get word back to me ran into the storm on the 2nd day and sheltered up in a line cabin until it passed. By the time I got back, the sentence did not finish. It didn't need to. Ellen understood what he was carrying, not the loss itself, because loss was its own country that everyone entered alone, but the specific species of guilt that comes from an absence at the exact wrong moment. The particular weight of having been somewhere reasonable, somewhere you were supposed to be, and having that reasonable absence become the fulcrum on which everything tipped. She knew that country. Different address, but the same streets. Doc Mercer told me, Grant said, that if someone had known what to do in the 3rd night the fever broke wrong, came back worse, she might have come through. He stopped. I've thought about that sentence every day for 4 years, Usus. Ellen did not tell him it was not his fault. People had been telling him that for 4 years, and it had not moved the thing because the thing was not located where reason could reach it. It lived somewhere older and more stubborn, in the place where the body keeps its accounting, even when the mind has long since been persuaded of a different ledger. Instead, she said, when I found you in the yard, your pulse was at about 40 beats a minute and your temperature was somewhere below what the body considers negotiable. She said it quietly. Factually. The fever broke at dawn. The critical point was somewhere in the 4th hour, when you were most restless. I held your hand through that part, a pause. I don't say that for credit. I say it because I want you to know that what Doc Mercer described, that particular window, that particular kind of night, I've sat through it. I know what it takes. And I know that you sitting here 4 years later does not mean you failed her. You weren't there. That is not the same thing. Grant stared into the fire, not agreeing exactly. Not disagreeing either. Processing the way a man processes something said by a person he has determined does not offer words for comfort's sake. You always know what to do, he said, finally, not as flattery. As an observation being spoken aloud for the first time, as though he'd been sitting with it for a while and had decided this was the moment to say it out of accuracy rather than admiration. I know what to do next. The distinction mattered to her. That's different from knowing what to do. I can't see the whole of a thing. I can only see the next piece of it. I look at that piece, do what it requires, and then look at the one after. He was quiet for a moment, looking not at her but at something in the middle distance that she understood was not in the room. Nora was like that. Said it without the weight of grief, for once with something closer to recognition, the tone of a person remembering a quality rather than mourning an absence. She could walk into a situation that would make most people freeze and just start. Start doing the thing that needed doing. It's a useful quality in ranch country. It's more than useful. He looked at her then, directly, across the small geography of the hearth. It's the thing that makes a person someone you want in your corner when things go wrong. Ella held his gaze without deflection. She was aware of being in a moment that required steadiness, not because the moment was dangerous, but because it was significant. And significant moments had a way of going wrong when people got nervous in them. She was not going to get nervous. I know what it took you to say what you just said. She kept her voice even. I appreciate the directness. He looked down at his hands. Back up. You came back to my ranch in the middle of a blizzard with nothing but what was on your back. Said it almost to himself. I wouldn't have opened the door a second time. Most people wouldn't have knocked. I came to ask to sleep in the barn. She kept the correction gentle, not correcting him so much as keeping the record straight. I wasn't feeling charitable toward you. The corner of his mouth moved in the shape where a smile would go if given slightly different circumstances. I know you weren't. I'm still not entirely charitable toward you. I know that too. And there it was, the first honest admission from both of them that there was ground to cover, and they were both aware of it. That was its own kind of progress, not resolution, not the clearing of all accounts. Just the acknowledgement that accounts existed and neither of them was pretending otherwise. She stood up after a while, when the fire had settled and the night outside had reached the deep, committed quiet of past midnight in winter. At the doorway to her room she paused, not because she intended to say something more, but because something said itself before she could decide otherwise. She would have liked how well you keep this land. She went in and closed the door, and stood in the dark a moment, listening to the fire, before allowing herself to consider that it was true. The fence line damage was worse than the morning after the storm had suggested. When they walked the north perimeter, 2 days later, Grant steady on his feet, the worst of the illness behind him, but still carrying the full movements of a body that remembered what the alternative felt like, they found not 3 sections compromised, but 5. The cuts were clean. Not wind damage, not ice heave, not the ordinary violence of a Wyoming winter on post and wire. Clean cuts, made with wire cutters, made by someone who knew exactly where to go in the dark. Ellen crouched in the snow beside the nearest post and examined the wire end. She turned it between her gloved fingers, examining the cut edge in the flat February light. These sections weren't all cut the same night. Grant looked down at what she was examining. How do you read that? The rust pattern at the cut edge. Oxidation rate in cold, dry air is consistent enough to use as a rough indicator. She moved to the next break, 30 yards east, and examined that end. East sections show more reoxidation at the cut face. These were done earlier a week ago, maybe slightly more. West sections are still bright at the cut. Those are from the night of the storm. He walked the line between the 2 breaks, looking from one to the other. He's been at this longer than I thought. He's been patient longer than you thought. She stood up and moved toward the 5th break, the westernmost one. That's different from being at it longer. He's been watching and waiting and doing small things that each look like they could be weather damage or animal pressure or ordinary winter wear. The cumulative effect is his, but no single act by itself is provable. Grant followed her along the fence. Doc Mercer told me the same pattern preceded the Glenmore sale. Ellen stopped at the fifth break. She looked north toward the boundary where Sumner land met the parcels. Pruitt had already acquired 2 ranches, absorbed one by one over 3 years, their original owners now working as tenants on land their fathers had homesteaded. She had heard about this in the way you hear things in small communities, incompletely, out of sequence, with the most important parts arriving last because people take the longest to say what they are most certain about. Who else is left in the original properties between here and the North Road? Grant came to stand beside her at the boundary. The Briggs family has the quarter section east of mine. Ed Briggs is 63 and not well. His son Calvin runs the place now. Pruitt made an offer last spring. Calvin turned it down. Came back in September with a better offer. Calvin turned that down too. Calvin Briggs knows what Pruitt is. Calvin Briggs knows what Pruitt is and still has to feed 4 children through a Wyoming winter on a quarter section that's been losing water access since Pruitt acquired the upstream rights on the East Creek in September. Ellen absorbed this. Upstream water rights. She had not known about the East Creek. The fence line damage was theater visible, dramatic, something to occupy attention and generate repair costs. The water access was the real mechanism. A fence could be fixed with labor and wire. Water in a high plains winter was arithmetic. You had it, or you ran the numbers on how long you could manage without it, and the numbers were always short. How long has the East Creek been restricted? Since the filing in September, Grant's characterized the flatness of someone reciting a thing they have been angry about long enough that the anger has compressed into something harder and more durable. Filed under irrigation improvement. Legal as a church bell, and your water comes from the west drainage off the Bighorn's slope. He doesn't have a position on that. Yet, he agreed. They stood in the cold and looked north and understood the shape of the thing, not just the fence line to which was already understood, but the larger geometry of what Pruitt was constructing around the edges of this property. He was not trying to break Grant Sumner. Breaking was noisy and provoked responses and drew the kind of attention that complicated future transactions. He was trying to make Grant Sumner tired. To accumulate the small weight of repairs and filings and nebulous difficulties until the sum of them pressed down heavier than one man wanted to carry alone, and then to arrive as he had arrived that morning in the cabin with his warm voice and his open concern with an offer that felt like rest. The offer of rest was the most dangerous thing in Pruitt's inventory, because the people he targeted were not weak people. They were tired people, and tired people, in Ellen's experience, heard the offer of rest as salvation, because when you were tired enough, that was exactly what it sounded like. We fixed the west 3 sections today, she said. The east 2 can wait. The cattle don't range that far in this weather, and the ground there is too exposed for the herd anyway. But the west line is where the animal pressure is, and we can't lose more stock. Grant was already turning toward the barn. I have replacement wire. Not enough for all 5. Enough for the west 3. Enough for the west 3, he confirmed. They worked the fence for 4 hours that afternoon, dividing the task by what each of them could do most effectively without discussion, and without the self-consciousness of 2 people who have not yet learned to share physical work. Grant handled the wire tensioning, which required upper body strength in sustained quantities she did not have in the same measure. Ellen handled the post assessment before each section and testing each post for ice heave and ground shift, because wire strung taut on a compromised post would fail again within 2 weeks and they would be back out here doing this again, and she did not intend to be back out here doing this again if it could be prevented. Neither of them commented on the division. Neither of them needed to. By the time they came in at dusk, her hands inside the gloves were aching in the bone-deep way that meant they had been cold for too long, and Grant had developed the set-jaw expression of a man whose body had been reminding him for the last hour that 4 days out of a serious illness was not equivalent to 4 days recovered. He had said nothing about it. She had not asked. There was a mutual agreement between them, unspoken and complete, that acknowledging the limit would mean stopping, and neither of them wanted to stop before the west line was done. The west line was done. She made soup that evening from salt pork and dried corn and a turnip that had held through the cold, and set it on the table without asking whether he was hungry, because the question was unnecessary. He ate with the attention of someone who had spent real physical effort and needed real fuel, not with appetite exactly, but with the focused consumption of a body doing its accounting. When he set the spoon down, he looked at the fire for a long moment. He's going to escalate. Yes, the fence line is a message as much as a tactic. He wants me to know the message is coming from him, even though the message can't be traced to him. He wants you to know you're alone, Ellen said. That's the message. That there's no one who can do anything about what he does, and no one who will, and the only question is how long you want to hold out against that arithmetic. Grant looked at her across the table. And what's the answer to that arithmetic? She picked up her cup. That the arithmetic changes when you're not alone. He held her gaze for a long moment, said nothing. But in the quality of the silence that followed, something shifted, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but with the specific solidity of a thing that has moved from one category into another and will not be moving back. Dale Voss arrived on a Tuesday. Ellen knew it was Tuesday because Tuesday was when she inventoried the pantry against the supply ledger, and she had just finished the second shelf and was working on the third when she heard hoofbeats in the yard that she did not recognize. Not Grant. She knew the sound of Grant's binos by now, the particular rhythm of that animal's approach, the way it slowed exactly 20 feet from the hitching post as though it had its own opinions about where to stop. This was different. A single rider moving with the careful pace of someone who had spent time on the road deciding whether to arrive. She went to the window. Dale Voss was 38 years old and looked like what Thomas might have looked like if Thomas had made different choices at every juncture where character is formed. The resemblance was there in the jaw and the height and the particular slope of the shoulders, enough that seeing him produced a moment of recalibration. The way walking into a room you used to know and finding it rearranged produces a moment before the brain updates its map. She did not need a moment. She had known. From the day she understood that Pruitt knew she was here, that Dale would come eventually. He was Pruitt's instrument in anything involving Thomas's name or Thomas's estate, and he had been that instrument long enough that the relationship had the worn-in quality of an arrangement both parties had stopped examining. Pruitt kept Dale's secrets. Dale kept Pruitt's errands. The logic was tidy and self-sustaining, and required nothing of either of them except the continued decision not to look at it directly. She was at the door before he dismounted. His face when he saw her, to 2 seconds of something genuine in it. She might have called it regret under different circumstances. Under these circumstances, she catalogued it as the opening position of a man who knows the woman he is here to pressure has a specific and documented reason to be angry with him, and who has calculated that the approach of regret is more likely to produce the outcome he was sent to produce than the approach of pressure. Ellen. He held his hat the way Thomas used to hold his hat, and she was going to have to be careful about that. Dale. She stood in the doorway. Did not invite him in. That the cold worked in her favor. It gave the conversation a natural clock because neither of them could stand in it indefinitely without cost. He glanced at the yard, the barn, the visible range of the property, a scan that was not casual. Not the glance of him noting where he was, but the specific look of someone recording information to report later. I heard you were here, he said. Looks like a good situation. It's work. I know how to do the work. I know you do. And he did know that, which was the problem with Dale. He was not stupid, and he had known her long enough to understand that flattery found no purchase, so he did not use it. He came in direct, the way you come in direct when you know the person you're addressing respects the approach, even when they're not going to like the content. I have a message from Pruitt. He didn't deny it. To his credit, he didn't try to dress it up. He wants me to tell you that your being here complicates things he would rather not have complicated, that it would be in your interest to move on. Before spring, before things get harder to resolve cleanly. Ellen looked at her brother for a long time. He held her gaze, which was something Thomas had said once, that Dale's worst quality and his best quality were the same thing, that he could look at the consequences of what he had done and not flinch. It made him reliable to people like Pruitt. It also meant that on rare occasions he was capable of a kind of honesty that served no one's interest but the truth's. She used that now. Dale, quiet and direct. You helped Pruitt get Thomas to sign those documents. I know it. You know it. And you know that Thomas didn't understand what he was signing because he was free 3 weeks from the end, and on enough laudanum that Doc Mercer had to record the dosage twice to believe the number himself. She watched his face. You didn't do it because you hated Thomas. You did it because Pruitt had something on you, and it was easier to give him Thomas than to give him yourself. That's the only version of events that accounts for you, because the alternative is that you're simply a man who would let his brother's widow be put off her land for personal profit, and I don't believe that's what you are. Dale was very still. I believe you are a man who made a choice under pressure and has been living inside that choice ever since, she continued. And I believe Pruitt knows exactly how to use that. He uses the knowledge of what you did to keep you available for the next errand, and he will keep using it until there is nothing left of you but the usefulness. She let that settle. So take the message back. Tell him I'm not moving. Tell him spring will come and I'll still be here, and the North Pasture will still belong to Grant Sumner. And if Pruitt wants to test that, he should come himself. Dale looked at his hat, and Dale, she waited until he looked up. When you're ready to stop being what he uses, that is a decision you can make. I can't make it for you, and I can't hold the option open indefinitely. But it exists, he rode out, not fast. Not the departure of a man dismissed or angry. The departure of a man thinking very hard about something he has not thought about this directly in a long time. Whether that thinking led anywhere useful she could not know, and she was practiced enough in realism not to assume that it would. But she had said the true thing, and the true thing was now in the air where he would have to breathe it on the way home, and that was all she could do. She went back inside and finished the third pantry shelf. Grant came in from the afternoon's work at 4 o'clock and found her, the table with the supply ledger open in front of her, in the expression she wore when she was working through a problem that the ledger could not solve. He hung up his coat. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking one whether she won a habit that had established itself somewhere in the second wake without either of them, marking the moment it became a mare, and brought both to the table and sat down across from her with the settled manner of a man prepared to receive difficult information. She told him about Dale. She told him all of it, not the version edited for someone else's comfort, but the complete version, including her own relationship to the material. Thomas, the documents, the laudanum, the 3 weeks of dying that she had sat with and that Pruitt had used as a window of opportunity. She had given him pieces of this before on that first morning in the cabin when she explained that she recognized Pruitt's methods from the inside. Now she gave him the whole. She told him because the whole was relevant. Because Dale Voss had been on this property and had recorded what he saw to report to Pruitt, which meant Pruitt now had a more complete picture of what was here. And because Grant had a right to the full picture of what he was standing alongside, not the edited version that protected her from the exposure of telling it, Grant listened with the dullness of a man who respects the weight of what he is being given. He did not interrupt. He did not make sounds of commiseration. He watched her face with the direct attention that she had learned was his highest form of engagement. When Grant Sumner looked at a person that way, he was receiving every word and would act on what he received. When she finished, he looked down at the coffee cup for a moment. Then Dale Voss is the reason you lost the Harmon job. She had not said that. She looked at him. Pruitt put it around that you had contested the estate documents. He didn't say you were dishonest, he's too careful for that. He made sure certain people knew you were difficult, that you created legal complications. Grant's voice had the flatness of someone translating a confirmed fact. I heard it 2 weeks before you came to my door the first time. Mercer told me. The information landed with the quiet force of something that does not knock you over, but changes the ground beneath you. You knew who I was, she said. When I knocked the first time, I knew your name and what Pruitt had said about you. A pause in which he was deciding exactly how much of the next thing to say, and then deciding to say all of it. Which is part of why I said what I said and closed the door. She looked at him steadily. Not with anger, it was a coin she spent carefully, and she had not decided yet that spending it here was the right use. With the precision of someone who needs to understand a thing correctly. What to do with it? You turned me away because Pruitt had marked me as trouble. I turned you away because I wasn't ready to have Pruitt look at this ranch twice at a time when I was trying to keep his attention elsewhere. He met her eyes without defense, which she noted, And then you saved my life anyway, and I had to decide what kind of man I was if I continued to act as though Pruitt's convenience was worth more than what you'd done and what you were owed," he stopped. "Ashamed is slower than honest. That's my accounting of why I didn't tell you this on the first morning." She had not expected that particular word from him. Not that Grant Sumner was incapable of it. She had now abandoned most of her early assumptions about what he was and wasn't capable of it, that he would say it at a kitchen table over coffee, plainly, without wrapping it in anything. She put her hands flat on the table, thought about it with the same precision she gave to fence assessments and supply inventories. "All right. We both had information we should have exchanged sooner. We've exchanged it." She picked up her coffee. "Don't mistake me for someone who has fully forgiven it. I'm someone who has filed it in the correct place and is choosing to proceed from here rather than from there." The corner of his mouth moved in the way she had come to recognize the shape where something lighter lived when he allowed it to. "Filed correctly? I have a system. I've noticed your system." He looked at the ledger on the table. "For the record, I'm glad you came back." Both times, she held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the ledger, because the ledger was what was in front of her, and she was a person who did what was in front of her. But she had heard him. She had put it in the correct file, and she was not going to take it out again and examine it unnecessarily. He refilled both cups and returned to his chair, and the evening settled around them with the particular quality of a night in which something important has been said, as men said. And the saying of it has not broken anything, but has instead made slightly more room. Pruitt is going to move before the ground thaws. Grant said it not as prediction but as fact, the kind of fact you state, because it needs to be in the room where decisions are being made. Whatever he intends next, additional filings, more fence damage, something against the water access, he'll time it, for when winter is still working against us, but close enough to spring that he can frame whatever he offers as a seasonal kindness. He likes to operate in that gap between the problem and the solution. 2 weeks, Ellen said without looking up. 3 at the outside, that's my estimate too. She set the pencil down, looked up at him. "Then we need Doc Mercer." Grant was quiet for a moment. "Why Mercer?" "Because Mercer has Thomas's medical record from the months before he died. He told me himself, said he kept it because it was his professional record and saw no grounds to release it without someone with standing to ask." She held Grant's gaze. "I have that standing. I was Thomas's wife, and if those documents were signed under conditions that any physician would describe as incompatible with legal comprehension, that is not a case that requires a courthouse. That is a case that requires a record and a person willing to say in public what they know to be true." Grant looked at her with the expression that had been developing over the past weeks, not admiration, because admiration implies surprises, and he had by now stopped being surprised by where she arrived. Something closer to recognition. The particular look of a man who has been working with a map and has just had someone show him the correct scale. "Pruitt will say the record is irrelevant to his acquisition of Sumner land," he said. "It's not about the land, it's about the pattern." She picked up the pencil again. "One compromised signature that Pruitt benefited from is an allegation. That same signature documented by a physician in front of a community that has watched Pruitt make the same approach to 4 properties in 4 years. That is something a great deal harder to dismiss as the grievance of one woman or the stubbornness of one rancher." Grant said nothing for a long moment. The fire worked steadily between them. "You've been thinking about this since that first morning?" "Since I saw Voss's name on that document on your table." She turned a page in the ledger. "I didn't say anything until I had enough pieces to make it useful. Saying things before they're useful doesn't accomplish anything except making you feel like you're doing something." He picked up his cup. "And now you have enough pieces. Now I have enough pieces." He nodded once, not the nod of agreement exactly, more the nod of a man marking a moment that will matter, recording it in whatever internal ledger he kept then. "I'll ride to Mercer's tomorrow. I'll ride to Mercer's tomorrow," she said. "You'll stay here and assess the east fence sections while the light holds." She said it without inflection, the way she said most things, not as a challenge, not as a test, simply as the logical division of 2 necessary tasks, a beat. Then, all right, she went back to the ledger. He sat with his coffee. The night outside was still and very cold, and somewhere in the town of Decker Falls, Harlan Pruitt sat with his documents and his timeline and his unrevised understanding of how the situation on Sumner Ranch was arranged. He was wrong about the situation. He would find that out before spring. March arrived the way Grant had said it would, not with the slow, negotiated retreat of a winter that has decided to be reasonable about things, with the particular stubbornness of a season that knows its time is ending and intends to make that ending felt before it goes. The temperature dropped 4 degrees in the second week. The snowpack on the north-facing slopes, which had begun to show the barest suggestion of softening at the edges, locked back down hard. The sky went the color of pewter and stayed there, low and flat and non-negotiable, pressing down on the bighorns and everything beneath them with the specific weight of weather that has unfinished business. Dorco Mercer rode out from town on a Wednesday. Ellen had not asked him to come. She had been planning to go to him, had told Grant as much the night before, had the route and the timing worked out in the way she worked out route and timing, accounting for road condition and weather window and what she would need to stay, and in what order. But Mercer came to her, and when she saw him coming up the road in the early morning, his old bay horse picking its way through the frozen ruts with the careful wisdom of an animal that has survived many Wyoming winters by refusing to hurry, she understood that some things move on their own schedule, regardless of yours. She had the coffee ready when he came through the door. He was 60 years old and looked it in the way that men who have spent decades doing difficult work in difficult conditions look their age not worn out, but fully occupied, the way a tool looks when it has been used correctly for a long time. He accepted the coffee, declined food, and sat down across from Ellen at the kitchen table with the deliberate posture of a man who has decided what he is going to say and wants the posture to match the intention. "I know you were Thomas Voss's wife," he began, not as a preamble, as a statement of the foundation on which what followed would rest. "I treated Thomas in his last months. I have the record of what he was and wasn't capable of during that time, including the period when he signed Harlan Pruitt's documents." He put both hands around the coffee cup. "I have kept that record because it is accurate and because a physician keeps accurate records on the principle that accurate records exist to tell the truth when the truth becomes necessary." He looked at her steadily over the rim of the cup. "I believe it has become necessary." Ellen sat across from him and felt something settle, not relief, which was too simple a word for what it was, but the specific sensation of a weight that has been carried alone beginning to be distributed across more than one point of contact. The difference between a single post and wire and a properly braced corner. "The record shows," Mercer continued, "that in the 3 weeks preceding Thomas's death, he was receiving doses of laudanum sufficient to substantially impair both judgment and cognition. This is not unusual in end-of-life care. I want to be precise about that, because I will not have the record misread as a criticism of the care given. What is not usual is that a man in that condition was presented with a legal document of the kind that requires clear comprehension of what one is agreeing to." He paused. "I was not present when he signed, but I was present every other day of that period, and I documented what I found, and the documentation speaks, and you'll say so, not a question." She already knew the answer. She was confirming it because confirmed things are different from assumed ones. "I'll say so." He set the cup down. "Not in a territorial court, not yet, and perhaps not ever, depending on how things develop. But in front of the people in this county who have been watching Pruitt acquire land for 3 years and who have not had a reason to say what they privately understand about how he does it." He looked at her with the directness of a man who has made a decision and is not going to revisit it. "I am 60 years old, and I have been the physician in Decker Falls for 22 of them. I delivered half the adults in this county when they were not yet adults. I have no debt to Harlan Pruitt and no ambition that he can threaten. Those qualities are not common in Decker Falls, and I am aware that they constitute a kind of freedom most people here do not have." Ellen looked at the man who had just placed the most significant resource in his possession on her side of the table, without being asked and without being owed. "Why now?" she said. "You've had this record for over a year." He considered this question with the honesty of a man who had earned the right to be asked it and knew it. "Because you're here. Because you're not asking Pruitt for anything, you're telling him. And because a physician can document the truth all he likes, but without someone with the standing to use it and the judgment to use it correctly. It is just paper in a drawer. He looked at the window, at the snow still accumulated against the glass. Thomas Voss was a decent man who died owing money he did not fully understand he owed. You were removed from your home by a process that used his incapacity as a mechanism. You have been working in other people's houses in Wyoming winter while the man responsible for that process rides around this county on an excellent horse. He looked back at her. I should have found a way to do something about this sooner. That is my honest accounting. She thought of what Grant had said 2 nights ago about shame being slower than honest and found it applicable for the second time in a week. We'll need the right moment, she said, and the right audience. The spring market, Mercer said immediately, which told her he had already thought this through, had probably been thinking it through since before he rode out this morning, last Saturday of March. Every rancher in the county comes in for the seasonal exchange. It is this day of the year when the crowd is large enough that Pruitt's presence doesn't control the room, because the room is too large for any one man to manage out without everyone seeing him manage it. He'll be there, he will. He cannot afford to be absent. Absence would read his acknowledgement. Mercer turned the coffee cup in his hands. But present, in that crowd, on that day, with Grant speaking and you speaking and the record available to anyone who asks to see it, that is a combination Pruitt has not had to face. He has always operated on the assumption that each person who knows something knows it alone. The day that assumption fails is the day his method fails with it. Ellen was quiet for a moment, looking at the table, at the surface of the situation and the piece beneath it that was now visible. I'll write it down, she said. Everything I know about the pattern, the sequence he uses, the properties, the timeline, the mechanism, not as accusation, as record, the kind of document that a person can read in 20 minutes and understand completely, because the facts explain themselves when they are in the right order. Mercer looked at her with something that was not quite approval. Approval was too simple and more like the expression of a man who has been waiting, without knowing he was waiting for someone to say the exact right thing. I'll make 2 copies of the medical record, he said. One stays in my office. One goes with the circuit rider who comes through in the 3rd week of March. He said it with the particular care of a man who has thought about what happens if the primary copy becomes unavailable. The circuit rider will be beyond reach before the market. Whatever Pruitt does between now and the last Saturday of March, he cannot reach that 2nd copy. Ellen nodded once. Then I need to tell Grant. I assumed you would. Mercer stood, put on his hat with the deliberate attention of a man for whom the hat was not incidental. At the door he stopped. The pause had the texture of something being chosen over something easier. Your husband talked about you, he said. In the end, when holding a thought required more than the laudanum left him with, he still managed that one. He said you were the best thing he hadn't earned. He opened the door to the cold. I thought you should know that. He rode back toward town. Ellen stood at the kitchen doorway and looked at the road and the sky and the western edge of it, where the light was doing something tentative, not quite the colors of change, more the precursor of them, the sky beginning to consider the possibility of eventually being different. She stood there long enough to let Thomas's words arrive at the place where they needed to go, and then she went in, closed the door, and began to write. The filing arrived on a Friday. Martha Briggs brought word of it, riding out from the edge of town on horseback in the early afternoon with the particular urgency of a woman who has spent 2 hours deciding to come and has concluded that the cost of not coming is higher than the cost of coming. She was Calvin Briggs's wife, a compact, serious woman in her mid-30s who had the look of someone who had been making difficult decisions for long enough that the process had become efficient. She came in, sat down at the kitchen table with her coat still on, and said what she had come to say without preamble, because preamble was not her way. Pruitt had filed a complaint against Mercer with the Territorial Medical Authority in Cheyenne. The complaint alleged that Mercer had improperly retained patient records and had disclosed confidential medical information for personal and political purposes. The filing named Ellen by name as the party to whom the disclosure had been made, which meant Pruitt had someone who had seen Mercer arrive at the ranch on Wednesday morning and had understood what the visit meant. When was this filed? Ellen said. Day before yesterday. Martha's hands were flat on the table, which Ellen read as the posture of a woman keeping herself from doing something with them. His land agent had the filing noticed in the county record by yesterday morning. Mercer saw it last night. How is Mercer? Angry? Martha allowed herself a brief expression that was not quite a smile, very specifically angry. The kind of anger that makes a man more determined rather than less. She looked at Ellen directly. He told Calvin last night that the day he allows Harlan Pruitt to determine what a physician does with an accurate medical record is the day he rides out of Decker Falls permanently. And he has no intention of riding out of Decker Falls. Ellen absorbed this, set it in the correct place in the larger picture. The second copy of the record, already gone with the circuit rider. Left Tuesday morning. Martha's voice carried the dry satisfaction of a person reporting a contingency that was prepared before the contingency was needed. Pruitt can file whatever he files. He cannot reach that copy before the territorial authority has a chance to review the original complaint, which will take months, and the market is in 3 weeks. Ellen looked at the table, at the shape of what Pruitt had just done. A medical complaint filed in Cheyenne against a local physician was not nothing. It was a real threat to a man's livelihood and standing. The kind of threat that required resources to defend against, even if the complaint ultimately failed. But it was also, she understood, a threat that carried information inside it. He filed it to rattle us, she said, and to tell us that he knows what we're planning. Yes, which means whatever we do in the next 3 weeks, he's watching and adjusting. Yes. Martha looked at her steadily. Calvin will be at the market, so will Ed if the weather holds. Ed hasn't come to a spring market in 2 years, she paused. The fact that he's planning to come to this one, Calvin wanted you to know that. After Martha left, Ellen stood at the window and did what she always did with new information, not reacted, not panicked, not revised her plan in the immediate heat of the moment when revision is most likely to be wrong. She let the information settle. She looked at what had actually changed and what had only appeared to change, and she separated those two categories carefully before she moved it. What had changed? Pruitt was accelerating. The filing was a move made by a man who felt the ground shifting under a plan that had been working on patience and now needed to work faster. It only appeared to change. The plan itself. The plan was still sound. The record existed in 2 places he could not reach. The market was still 3 weeks away. The people who were coming to stand in that street were still coming. She went to find Grant. He was in the barn doing the work of late afternoon, systematic and unhurried, the work of a man who processes difficult things through his hands. He had the look of someone who had been thinking hard about something without yet arriving at where the thinking was going to land. She told him about the filing. She told about Martha's visit and Calvin Briggs's message and the copy of the record already beyond Pruitt's reach. She told him in the order that mattered, and she watched his face move through it the way it always moved through important information without pressure on the surface, processing completely underneath. When she finished, he set down the tool he'd been holding, looked at the barn wall for a moment with the particular stillness of a man arriving at a conclusion. He filed it to make Mercer uncertain. To make us uncertain about whether Mercer will stand? Yes. He's never had to deal with someone who isn't uncertain. Ellen looked at him. We don't change what we're doing? No. He turned to face her fully. In the afternoon light coming through the barn door, his face had the quality of a man who has located the thing he stands for and is speaking from that position rather than toward it. We go to that market and we say what we know. Whatever he does between now and then, she agreed. He nodded, picked the tool back up. Then, without looking at her, in the tone of a man saying something that has been ready to be said for longer than this moment, I want you to know that I decided what this ranch was going to be before any of what's coming started. I decided it the morning I watched you sleep in that chair. He kept his eyes on the work. I decided it when I understood what it cost you to come back to a door that had already been closed in your face, and to do the right thing anyway when you found what you found in the yard. I want you to know that was when I decided, not later, and not because of what you could do for the land. Ellen stood in the barn doorway with that, not filing it, not analyzing it. Standing in it for a moment, the way you stand in the first real warmth of a season that has been very long and very cold, before it becomes ordinary and you stop noticing it. I know, she said finally. I've known for a while, he looked up. How long? Since you moved the hay without being asked. He made a sound that was the first fully realized laugh she had heard from him, brief, caught off guard, completely genuine in the way of sounds that arrive before the person producing them has decided whether they're appropriate. It changed his face entirely, and she stored the change in whatever part of her kept things that deserved to be kept. "The hay," he said. "The hay." He shook his head and went back to work, and she went back to the house, and the barn held the last of the afternoon, light and the slow sounds of animals settling toward evening. And somewhere to the south Harlan Pruitt sat with his filings and his patience and his unrevised belief that the situation was still arranged in his favor. He was going to find out that it was not. The last Saturday of March fell clear and cold, the sky a hard bright blue that Wyoming produces in late winter when the storms have finally exhausted themselves and the air has not yet softened into the uncertainty of early spring. The road to Decker Falls was frozen solid underfoot and passable, which was all it needed to be, and every rancher in Crook County who had been waiting for a passable road since November was on it. Grant drove off. Ellen sat beside him on the bench with her hands in her coat pockets, the document she had written over the past 2 weeks folded inside her coat against her chest. The morning was cold, but the kind of cold that comes with light rather than against it, and the drive into town had the quality of a thing that's been decided and is now simply being executed. Decker Falls received them with the full assembly of a community that has only a few occasions large enough to require everyone at once. The street was already busy when they arrived at the hitching posts and wagons in the yard behind the general store, and the specific layered noise of 100 conversations happening simultaneously. The seasonal sound of people who have not seen each other since November having the conversations that November interrupted. The arrival of Grant Sumner with a woman beside him, on the bench, a woman about whom the town had formed opinions, received partial information and arrived at incomplete conclusions over the past 2 months, produced the effect of a stone dropped in occupied water. Not dramatic, noticeable. Conversations paused and resumed. Eyes moved and then moved away and then moved back. The particular social weather of a small community, registering something new and deciding what it meant. Ellen let it be noticeable. She got down from the wagon with the manner of a person who had decided where they stood and was proceeding from that decision. Mercer found them within 10 minutes. He had the look of a man who had slept adequately and was angry in the way that focuses rather than scatters the clean, direct anger of someone who has been threatened and has decided that the threat has made him more committed rather than less. He carried nothing visible, but she knew the record was in his coat. She did not ask. Some things you know without asking. Calvin Briggs was there with Martha and with his father, old Ed Briggs, moving slowly but present, which meant more than presence alone could communicate. Ed Briggs was a name in this county that predated Pruitt's arrival by 2 decades, and his appearance at the spring market for the first time in 2 years was itself a statement, legible to everyone who knew him and what his absence had meant. Pruitt arrived mid-morning. Of course he arrived mid-morning. He could not afford to arrive late, which would read as avoidance, or early, which would read as anxiety. Mid-morning was just the arrival of a man who had calculated the exact right moment to make his presence felt without making it look calculated. He came with 2 men whose function was not specified and did not need to be, and he moved through the market in the way he moved through all public spaces, greeting people, being warm, being the specific version of himself that he deployed when the audience was large, the version that had built him goodwill in this town over three years and given him the comfort of believing that goodwill was the same as loyalty. Ellen once watched him work the crowd and registered, without rancor, that he was very good at it. That was worth acknowledging before anything else. He was very good at this, which meant that what she was about to do needed to be something other than a performance, because he would win any performance. He had been performing in this town for 3 years and she had been here for 2 months. What she had that he did not have was the record, and the record was not a performance. The record was simply accurate. She did not announce anything. Announcements gave Pruitt time to position himself, to choose his stance, to frame his expression before the room saw it. She simply began speaking, in the clear carrying voice of a woman who had managed livestock in open fields and understood rejection as a practical matter. standing near the front of the general store where the largest concentration of people had gathered. I want to tell the people here about a pattern I have observed, not I want to accuse, not I have evidence. A pattern she had observed. The language of a witness, the nearest conversations paused. The pause extended outward in rings. The way a stone dropped in still water extends until a significant portion of the street had quieted and the people who had not heard the beginning were moving towards the sound. She laid it out. In the order she had written it factually, one piece at a time, with the specific dates and the specific properties and the specific sequence that Pruitt used at each one. The preliminary approach, always friendly, always patient. The small legal filings, water rights, easements, boundary adjustments, each one innocuous in isolation, each one a brick in a wall being built around the target property. The escalating pressure as the target's resistance wore down. And then the document, arriving at the moment when the owner was most depleted, most isolated, and least able to evaluate what they were agreeing to. She named the properties in order. She named the years. She named the owners, most of whom were known by name to most of the people in that street, and several of whom were standing in it. She did not name Pruitt for the first 3 minutes. She did not need to. The room was doing it for her. She could see people looking at him, looking away, looking back, the specific expression of people performing a calculation in real time and finding that the answer is not what they expected. When she named him, it was without heat. The way you name the element that completes a pattern because accuracy requires it, not because the naming itself is the point. All 4 acquisitions which were made by Harlan Pruitt in this county between 1884 and 1887. I know this pattern from the inside because my husband's property was the 3rd. The street was very quiet. Then Doc Mercer stepped forward. He was not a man who gave speeches. He was a man who stated findings, which carried more weight in a crowd of practical people than rhetoric ever could. He described Thomas Voss's medical condition in the weeks before he signed Pruitt documents. He described the dosage he had been maintaining and what that dosage did to a person's capacity for legal comprehension. He said that he had retained the medical record because accurate records exist to be accurate, and that the record was available to any legitimate authority that wished to examine it. He did not say Pruitt had done anything wrong. He said what Thomas's condition was and what it meant. He let the room supply the conclusion. Ellen watched Pruitt's face through this. He was very controlled. The warmth was gone. He had not attempted to maintain it once she started speaking, which was the right choice. The warmth would have read as performance, and he knew it. What replaced it was a composed neutrality, the face of a man who has rehearsed for this kind of difficulty and is executing the rehearsal. He waited until Mercer finished, and then he moved forward with the unhurried ease of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and has learned that hurry is the first thing that loses them. I have a great deal of sympathy for Mrs. Voss. He said it to the crowd. Not to her a choice, she noted. Losing a husband is a hard thing. Finding oneself in difficult circumstances is a hard thing. But what she is describing is a series of fair and legal business transactions. Every document was properly witnessed. Every sale was concluded in accordance with the law of this territory. He glanced at Mercer with the expression of a man being generous in the face of an inconvenience. And this suggestion that Thomas Voss signed under compromised conditions is the opinion of one physician who has, I might note, been the subject of a professional complaint filed last week regarding the improper use of patient records. He stopped there. Let it land. The complaint introduced as a counterweight. It was good. She had expected it to be good. What he had not expected was Grant. Grant Sumner, sir, was not a man who prepared speeches. He did not move forward with choreographed art timing. He moved forward because standing still had become a thing he was no longer willing to do. And he said what I had to say in the voice of a man who has decided what is true and has no investment in the truth being comfortable. Harlan, just the name. The crowd heard the quality of it, not angry, not conciliatory. Something that had moved past both of those into the register of simple fact. You have made me an offer on my north pasture 3 times. You have sent men to cut my fence line in the night. You had my bull killed at the property boundary in February. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. I am not going to sell you that land, not this spring and not in any other season. and the people in this street deserve to know that what Mrs. Voss has described is not a grievance or a coincidence. It is how you do business. I know it is accurate because I have been on the receiving end of it since October. The street had the quality of a room where something that has been known privately is being said for the firm. Particular fed publicly when the particular stillness of because what is happening in front of them is going to matter to their own life, boss. And they understand that. Pruitt looked at Grant. Something shifted behind the pale eyes, not fear. Something colder than fear. The recalibration of a man whose method depends on isolation, and who is understanding in real time that the isolation he counted on is not as complete as he believed. He gathered himself, applied the warm voice one final time, with the precision of a craftsman using the right tool in the wrong conditions and knowing it but having no better option. Grant, I understand you have concerns. Atlanta has been down and talked through any. We've talked. Grant's voice had not changed register or temperature. This is the conversation that should have happened in this street in front of the people you've been conducting your business around. Briggs said it then from somewhere to the left, 2 people deep in the crowd, in the voice of a man who has been waiting for permission and has just received it. My water? 2 words. Said the way you say then of something that has been taken from you. Pruitt filed on the East Creek in September. My family has run cattle on that water for 19 years. He filed it as irrigation improvement. I have to drive my herd 1.5 miles south in winter to water them. He looked at the people near him. That is not a business transaction, that is a siege. The word arrived in the street and stayed there, siege. Not an accusation, a description. The specific word for a specific thing that everyone who had been watching the edges of Pruitt's operations for 3 years had understood without having the word for it, and now had it. Pruitt stood very still. Ellens watched him absorb the word and perform the arithmetic, and arrive at the conclusion that the arithmetic had changed. She had been waiting for this moment, for the specific instant, when a man who has been winning by a particular method encounters the limit of the method. It looked exactly like what it was. A man who has been operating on the assumption that each person who knows something knows it alone, discovering that the assumption has failed. He did not argue further. This was the most revealing thing he did. A man who still believed he could win the room would argue. The man who adjusted his expression to something that communicated conclusion rather than continuation was a man who was already past this moment and thinking about the next adjustment. I'm happy to address any legitimate concerns through appropriate channels, said to the air. Then he put on his hat and he walked to his horse, and his 2 men followed him, and he rode south on the Decker Falls Road at the pace of a man who has decided that his pace is the last thing he can still control and is controlling it deliberately. The street watched him go. Then the street turned back toward where Ellen and Grant and Mercer and Calvin Briggs and old Ed Briggs were standing, and there was a long moment in which the outdoor room of a Wyoming street in late March held the collective weight of what had just happened and made its accommodation of it. Ed Briggs said, Well, 1 syllable. In the voice of a man who has been in this county for 3 decades and whose opinions require no elaboration because the people around him know exactly what they mean. The word carried a complete judgment in the economy of a man who had never wasted one. Mercer met Ellen's eyes across the crowd with an expression that said, You were right about the room. She did not say anything back. There was nothing to say that the moment had not already said. He came to the ranch that afternoon. Ellen had half expected it. Grant had not. She saw the surprise in the set of his shoulders when they heard the horse in the yard on their return and looked out and understood who it was. Single rider, no escort, hat in hand before he even dismounted, which was the first data point and not a small one. Grant opened the door. Pruitt stood at the threshold in an attempt to enter. He looked at Grant, and then past Grant at Ellen, and his face had shed both the public warmth and the composed neutrality of the market street. What was left was the face of a man in his mid-50s, who has built something carefully over a long time and is holding a conversation with the possibility that it can be taken apart by people he underestimated. I want to make a final offer on the North Pasture, he said it to Grant. Fair market value. No conditions attached. Grant looked at him for the length of time it took to be certain of the answer. No, Grant. The answer has been no 3 times. It's no a fourth time, not heated. The voice of a man whose decision is not a position being defended, but a fact being stated. And the complaint you filed against Mercer, withdraw it. Pruitt held Grant's gaze. That's a separate matter. It is not separate. Ellen spoke from inside the doorway, at Grant's shoulder. You filed it to undermine a witness before he could speak, and to tell us that you were watching and that you knew what we were planning. We received the message. She kept her voice as level as February fence wire. Withdrawing it won't undo what you've done to the properties you've already acquired, and it won't undo what was said in that street this morning. But it would indicate that the morning has been received in the spirit it was intended. Pruitt looked at her. The full attention of a man and who has spent the better part of a winter declining to give her his full attention. And is now for the first time giving it. You're not afraid of me? He said it not with anger and not with admiration, with neutral tone of a man identifying if a fact he has been slow to locate. I've already had everything that fear of you produces, Mr. Pruitt. She held his gaze without effort. I had it taken from me before I came here. The tools you rely on require someone to have something left to lose by them. I don't say that as a threat, I say it, so you understand why the approach hasn't worked. Something moved across Pruitt's face, not the recalibration of the Market Street, which had been the adjustment of a man surprised by numbers. This was something quieter, the specific expression of a man encountering a kind of honesty he has not been given in a long time, and finding that it produces, against his interest and against his expectation, a response in him that resembles respect. He was quiet for a long moment. I'll withdraw the complaint, flat. A business decision made and stated as such. The north pasture is not for sale, Grant said. Now or at any later date. Pruitt looked at the ranch, the fence line visible from the yard, the barn, the north pasture beyond it where the snow was beginning to thin, at the south-facing edge, the specific arrangement of a working property that has been looked after by people who understand what they have. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is closing his account on. You built something here, he said. The words came out directed at Grant but landed on both of them, and they both understood it. I'll give you that. He put his hat on. He walked to his horse. He mounted without hurry and rode south on the road that led back to Decker Falls and whatever the next chapter of Harlan Pruitt's operations would look like once he had finished adjusting to this one. Grant closed the door. They stood in the front room of the ranch house, and neither of them spoke for a moment. The fire in the hearth was burning at the level Ellen had set it to that morning, steady, sufficient, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The afternoon light came through the windows at the angle of a sun that had moved measurably further north than it had been a month ago, the subtle and reliable arithmetic of a season that is actually, finally, turning. Grant said, It's not over, no. She picked up her coat from the chair and hung it properly on the hook. He'll find a different angle. That's what men like him do. They don't stop, they adjust. But adjusting costs time, and time is what we have now. He looked at her. We. She turned around to find him watching her with the direct attention she had come to know, as the way he looked at things that mattered to him. You and me, and the north pasture, and the fence line, and the supply ledger, and whatever the next thing is. She met his eyes without evasion. That is what we means. Something in his face completed itself, not the near expression she had catalogued in the earlier months, something that had arrived at its full form. He said Ellen, just her name, the way he had said it a few times before in moments that had mattered, but this time with a different weight behind it, the weight of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether this is the moment. I know, she said. I haven't said it yet. I know what you're going to say, do you? Yes. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her across the room that had held both of them through a winter that had asked more of each of them than either had expected to give. Then say it. She looked at him. At the face she had watched through a February fever and a March that had required everything they had. At the eyes that had been the first thing she had assessed, and the last thing she had fully understood. You want me to stay, she said. Not as housekeeper, not through spring, not by the terms of an arrangement we agreed to on a January morning when we were still measuring each other for fit. You want me to stay as the person who is here when things go wrong and when they go right, and when they go the ordinary way that most days go, which is what most days are. She held his gaze. You want to reach across the table in the evening, and have that be unremarkable because it has been the same for long enough to simply be what is. Grant had gone very still in the way he went still when something reached the place in him where this was the only honest response. And you want me to say yes, she said. He looked at her across the room that was warm and theirs, and still standing. Yes, he said. To all of it, she said. Yes, back. Not decorated, not performed. The way two honest people confirm a true thing simply, because the truth doesn't need anything added to it to be the truth. He crossed the room and took her hand, and his grip was the careful, certain grip of a man who has held this hand once before of a February night and understands exactly what he is holding and exactly what he is not going to be careless with. The June evening came with the quality of a Wyoming summer that has been earned through everything that preceded it. After a winter that long, after a spring that arrived in increments rather than all at once, a degree at a time. A week of mud followed by a week of cold, followed by 2 weeks of something that was finally genuinely warm. June arrived, and it was everything the almanac suggested it could be. The grass on the north pasture stood at a height that made a person want to put a hand down and feel it. The air in the evenings carried the cut grass and wood smoke smell that is the specific scent of a ranch operating the way it is supposed to operate. The fence line that had been cut and rebuilt and cut again and rebuilt properly ran clean and true along the north boundary, the new posts still pale against the ground that had accepted them. Grant asked her at the fence. Not at the kitchen table, not in the formal staging of a moment designed to look like the thing it was. At the fence they had assessed together in February and repaired together in March, and that now ran the boundary of the land they had stood in that street in Decker Falls to keep. He came up beside her in the long evening light with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who has decided that this is the moment because this is the place. And the place where you say a thing like this should be the place where true things have happened. He said it plainly, in the voice that never used more words than the words needed. He said he wanted her to be his wife. He said it without decoration, because he had learned, over a winter of watching her, that she received things directly and that the most honest way to offer her something was without the ornament that would suggest he was uncertain about it. Ellen looked at him in the evening light, looked at the pasture and the barn and the ranch house with its kitchen window catching the last of the sun. Then she looked back at him. Yes, she said. The same register, the same simplicity. He reached across the fence rail and took her hand, and she let him take it, and the grip had in it all the things that had built it: the winter, the fever, the fence repairs in February cold, the market street in March, the kitchen table and the ledger, and every evening that had been ordinary enough to prove that what was between them was not a crisis response, but an actual thing that existed in normal time as well as difficult time. They stayed at the fence until the light was nearly gone, not talking much, because there was nothing need to be said that the evening was not already saying around them. The winter of 1889 came the way Wyoming winters come, without apology and without concern for what had happened in the previous year or any year before it. The cold came down from the bighorns with its conviction fission, and the snow accumulated in its familiar layers, and the work that a ranch requires in winter was the same work it had always been, which was considerable and continuous and not romantic in any particular way. Ellen Voss Sumner did it the way she did all work. Early, thorough, without drama, with the specific attention of a person who has learned that the gap between what is maintained and what is neglected is the gap between surviving a Wyoming winter. And not the difference from the previous winter was the arithmetic of the house. The child came in November, a boy, born in the bedroom at the back of the ranch house, with Doc Mercer attending, and Grant in the kitchen, making coffee he did not drink, sitting in the chair with the particular stillness of a man in whom waiting has become particularly difficult. When Mercer came out to tell him, Grant went in and stood in the doorway looking at Ellen in the bed and the child in the crook of her arm, and his face had the expression of a man who has been given more than he expected and is taking a moment to absorb the full extent of it before he speaks. They named him Thomas. It was Grant's suggestion. Offered in the careful way, he offered things he understood might carry weight in more than one direction. He held it out with the full knowledge that she'd take it or leave it as she chose, and no weight attached either way. She had looked at him when he said it, a look that lasted several seconds and took in the whole of the man who would offer such a thing without making it about his own generosity, and said yes. Thomas Sumner slept in the cradle Grant had built from oak, working on it in the evenings after supper while Ellen sat across from him at the table with whatever needed doing in her hands, the two of them in the companionable quiet that had been one of the first things they built and had proven to be one of the most durable. The tin photograph of Nora stayed on the shelf beside the lamp, where Grant had always kept it, in the spot where it was available to his own eyes without being a statement to anyone else. Ellen had not moved it in a year, and would not. Some things earn their place in a house through what they mean to the person who put them there, and a house that belongs to two people is built from both people's histories, not only the history that belongs to the present. She had understood this from the beginning, in the way she understood most things that mattered. Clearly, from the start, without needing to arrive at it gradually, Dale Voss had left Decker Falls by April. She heard it from Martha Briggs in passing. He had ridden out one morning with what fit in his saddlebags and had not come back, and no one had received word of where he had gone. She did not know whether he had made the decision she had put in front of him at the door that Tuesday, or whether he had simply run from the wreckage of what Pruitt's retreat had left behind, or whether those two things were, in the end, the same decision wearing different clothes. She did not ask and did not pursue the question. She had told him the door was not closed. Whatever he had walked through on the way out of Decker Falls was his own reckoning to carry, and she had enough faith in the principle of honest reckoning to let it stand. Harlan Pruitt remained in Decker Falls. He had not disappeared and had not been destroyed, and she had never expected either. He filed no further complaints against Mercer. He made no further approaches to Grant about the North Pasture. He conducted his business in the county with the particular care of a man who understands that the ground has shifted and is proceeding accordingly. Calvin Briggs's water access on the East Creek was restored, a quiet counterfiling in May, a piece of legal work that bore Doc Mercer's name as witness and Grant's name alongside Calvin's as co-petitioners, a small, precise correction that did not make the front page of anything and did not need to. On a morning in February, the 2nd February, Ellen had been on this land. 1 year from the month in which everything had turned, Grant came in from the early barn work and found her standing at the kitchen window with Thomas against her shoulder, looking out at the yard. As no one to North Pasture was the clean, unmarked white of new overnight fall. Not the heavy, contested accumulation of a winter doing its worst, but the ordinary seasonal snow that a working ranch receives and manages and proceeds around. Because that is what working ranchers do. He stopped inside the door and looked at her, and she turned and looked at him, and Thomas made the small sound he made when he was between sleeping and waking and trying to decide which direction to go. Grant crossed the kitchen. He put his hand against the side of Thomas's head with the particular care of a man who is still learning the weight of something new and does not want to get it wrong. Then he looked at Ellen beside him and out the window at the North Pasture that was theirs, that was going to remain theirs. That a January blizzard and one woman's refusal to stop moving through it had made it possible to keep. Still here, he said, quietly. The two words she had said to him in the worst of a February night a year ago, returned now in a different register, not reassurance this time, not a person talking someone back from the edge of something, but confirmation, the statement of a man looking at what is in front of him and finding it exactly what he wanted to find. Ellen looked at him. Still here, she said back. Outside, the snow came down without agenda over Sumner Ranch, over the North Pasture and the fence line and the barn and the road that had brought her here against all reasonable calculation, over the land that had been threatened and was standing, over everything that had been built and everything held. The things that mattered were inside, and they stayed.